This is Dateline News and Conversation. I'm going to continue the discussion that I've created in a monologue and in an article that I released about United States foreign policy and how it really doesn't change. It certainly doesn't depend on the President of the United States. So the topic for today is going to be the continuity of agenda, the real history of U.S. foreign policy. My guest, my good friend, a regular on the show, Eric Arnow. Eric, welcome back to the show.
Regis, great to see you again.
Always. And you have written an article and you made a video about a topic that I addressed recently, and I wanted to continue because you actually dove in much deeper into the historical context of the roots of American exceptionalism and foreign policy. So I want to dig down into that with you today. Tell me, what do you mean by the continuity of agenda?
The agenda of the United States is based on several, I would say, very, very deep ideological foundations. The supremacist notion that Western civilization, specifically American civilization, is superior to other civilizations. It's based on religious fanaticism because one of the main original ideologues of the U.S. ideology was Cotton Mather, who was a Puritan, basically a religious fanatic who came over from England, and he saw no problem in slaughtering Indians because they were racially inferior. And so you have that kind of that aspect of it, and you also have the what I would call the predator, essentially proto-capitalist class, which is who's the president of the United States? He was a real estate speculator. That was George Washington. So, and they were slave traders, slave owners, and wealthy merchants. And these are the people who basically have taken control of the narrative in the United States to the detriment of the humanitarian faction, which has always been on its back foot in the 250-odd year history of the United States.
Okay, so we can go way back in history, going all the way back to the colonialists, George Washington being a real estate developer. That whole concept of Winthrop, of America's exceptional nation, blessed by God, the city on the hill, which has become part of not only the United States narrative, but the DNA of this country. Mm-hmm. Now, we could trace that many times throughout history. World War I, World War II, this Cold War, the period that we're in today. And that begs the question, like, who actually drives this agenda? Now, you mentioned that these early founding fathers created a system, and they have descendants, I should say, who basically have
yeah. War crime descendants.
Yeah. You've called them gangsters, but anyway, we'll get to that later. Let's focus on today and the recent era, and who actually drives the agenda. You have actually written, and you stated in your video, that decisions are not made in public, but in exclusive meetings in lavish clubs across the East Coast and dinners at the Harvard Club. What are you talking about?
Uh, I have to give due credit to Pepe Escobar for that. Um, what happened was he made a video with Danny Haiphong, I believe it was, in which he that question was raised, and he said that's where these decisions are made. They're made in these private clubs, and nobody really has access to the the minutes of what they're talking about. So I basically took was in complete agreement with that, and in a private message to Pepe, I pointed out that there was a poem of 19th century United States about Boston, because the Boston Brahmins, these are the high priests of the U.S. religion, the Brahmins being the high priest in Hinduism, but here we're talking about the Brahmins of the United States. And there was this poem which said, here's to dear old Boston, the home of the beans and the cod, where the Cabots speak only to the Lowells, and the Lowells speak only to God. So that you have the Cabots, the Lowells, the Putnams, the various old money managers, and these are the people who essentially have been running the country since its inception. It's not just Boston, of course, but they were like the kernel of this whole system.
Yeah, well, I grew up in New England and went to school in the Boston area, and very familiar with the old money, the Cabots, the Lodges, the Lowells, and their descendants basically have controlled money and industry for all of these years. Really, not much has changed. Now, you went on to talk about, and you asked a question, and you were referring to Howard Zinn's The History of the United States, and you said, is there any connection between the genocide ongoing in Gaza and the settler colonial state of Israel and the ongoing hostility to Russia, China, Iran, and other countries currently in the crosshairs of the United States? How do you interpret that? What do you really mean?
What I'm saying is that from the very beginning, when the colonists came to the United States, there were two, broadly speaking, two factions. There were people who were legitimately escaping religious persecution and economic oppression, but the people who got control of the whole narrative wrote the U.S. Constitution and basically determined the history of the future history of the United States were these essentially predators, which you could say they were gangsters, because their attitude was to get control of the Indians, tell the Indians what they were going to do and what they weren't going to do, and slaughter them in large numbers. So that's where I see the beginnings of the whole genocide program. I don't know if you want me to.
Actually, Eric, when you look at the entire history of the United States, it began with the theft of land and resources and the genocide of people who were in their way.
Exactly.
And
yeah, one of the Indians that I quote said we fought the white man, and the white man basically dictated to us that we had to leave where we were and go someplace else because they wanted. So this is pure settler colonialism backed by the real threat and the actual genocide of these peoples.
Well, and then it continued, really with slavery, which was the theft of resources, the theft of labor, upon which the entire United States economy was built, the theft of African American labor. And then as they pushed across the country, it was again a need that these people had the ones in control, for more resources, more territory. When they ran out of room, they continued going really around the world. And Eric, when we hear the phrase, the term America's interests, America's security interest around the world, this has got nothing to do with the safety and security of continental United States of America.
Absolutely.
It has everything to do with America's need and thirst for additional land, resources, and labor. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Whenever they say we the people, they're not talking about you and me. They're talking about the people who belong to those private clubs. That's their idea of America. When there was a coup against FDR planned in 1934, these captains of industry got together and said, what Roosevelt's doing is going against what we've done to build the country, forgetting the fact that there were workers who did the work. All they did was, they did some planning and plotting. But this is the policy. This is the ongoing policy. You have a small group of people who are mobilizing everybody to do what they want for their interests, and they conflate it with our interests, yours and my interests. And of course, it's a complete fabrication.
Well, let's look now at the seeds of U.S. endless war abroad. Because as we look back over the history of the United States, it really has been one of endless war, whether it be with the Native Americans, whether it be with Africans, whether it be with people from Asia, the Philippines. We can't leave out the UK, England out of this, because they were the major colonialists in China and India. But it's always been about endless war and subduing, basically people of color. And you said something in your video, and you wrote, which is really incredible. And people need to focus on these kinds of things. Teddy Roosevelt wrote to a friend in 1897, in strict confidence, I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one. Eric, let's fast forward from Teddy Roosevelt to World War I.
Mm-hmm.
It was supposed to be a war to end all wars, but was it not just another Wall Street war?
Absolutely. No, I'm not completely familiar with the situation, but the British were deeply in debt to the United States, and they had to win that war, because if they didn't win the war, then they wouldn't have been able to pay the debt back. So the United States was, you could say, more or less dragged into the war in order to protect its own financial interests.
Well, it's always been about money. These wars have always been about money. Teddy Roosevelt was right, I believe, that America needs a war. We can fast forward to World War II, and both you and I have documented the history of that. And I want to focus on something that I really emphasized in my monologue in an article I wrote last week. World War II really was a turning point, and actually was the beginning and foundation for United States foreign policy in the 20th century. The Dulles brothers, Allen Douglas, who became the head of the CIA.
Allen Dulles.
Allen Dulles, his brother John Foster Dulles became the Secretary of State, and they worked with people like Prescott Bush, who really was a Nazi or a Nazi collaborator, the father of George Herbert Walker Bush and W. They were investing money in making deals with Hitler, with the Nazis, and with German industrialists to promote the war. They wanted to use Germany as a proxy against the Soviet Union. And it was only when Hitler went rogue that they allied with the Soviet Union, but only temporarily. Do you want to pick the narrative up from there?
Okay, just to expand on it, the Dulles brothers were partners, I guess, in a law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, which is a Wall Street firm, and they were financing the Nazis. And during World War II, Allen Dulles was actually secretly collaborating with the Nazis. He was in contact with the German resistance, and the German resistance said, please help us. And he said, oh, gee, we'd really like to do that, but he wasn't doing that. He was collaborating with SS General Wolf in order to create a separate peace, so that the Western Allies would then unite and then re-invade the Soviet Union together. And of course, after World War II ended, Allen Dulles protected these people from prosecution and having their assets taken away from them. So he was hiding their assets. Now, this was documented by a fellow named John Loftus, who was one of the lawyers for the Nuremberg trials. So the whole history of the United States has been, if you look at it, starting with the genocide of the native peoples and the ruthless expansionism, and supporting a country, Germany, which also had a policy of genocide and ruthless expansionism, that they're kissing cousins. It's been like that all along. And after World War II, the Nazi collaborators, whose head was Stefan Bandera. He was a Ukrainian ultranationalist, and he had the same ideology of racial supremacy and ruthlessness, and he was protected by the CIA. Many of these Ukrainian Nazis were protected by the United States, protected by Canada and the United States. So they nurtured this cancer within Ukraine for decades, and they finally got their wish when the Soviet Union ended, and that gave them a free hand to allow many NGOs and people like that to come in and undermine Ukrainian long-standing fraternal relations with Russia. So they basically turned brother against brother, and this is essentially a continuation of a Nazi project that had been going on, for decades earlier, before this war broke out in 2022.
Yeah, and a friend of mine, Douglas Valentine, who has written and lectured extensively on the role of the CIA post-World War II under Allen Douglas, and the CIA's role in Ukraine, going back to what you're talking about right now with Stefan Bandera and the ultranationalists. So the CIA has been behind that for all of these years. Now, Allen Dulles, when he created the CIA, he created really an organization with almost no oversight, presidential or congressional. Mm-hmm. It's actually a rogue organization. It's got a black budget. Nobody knows where it comes from. Well, a lot of it comes from drug running and arms running. But Allen Dulles was responsible for bringing some 1,100 of those Nazi technicians, engineers, scientists. Wernher von Braun headed up NASA's Apollo moon project, and they placed them throughout different levels of government, And that's known as Operation Paperclip. But the thing about Alan Dulles, which I want to talk about as we continue this discussion, he didn't believe that the CIA should just be about gathering of information, analysis. He believed that the CIA should basically determine United States foreign policy. And what he did was he implemented a program of espionage, color revolutions, extrajudicial killings, political assassinations, coups d'etats, and even paramilitary operations in countries all over the world. Eric, the CIA, and one could argue that they basically are the strong arm of these moneyed, wealthy people dating back to the early days of the American Revolution, Boston, New York moneyed people, and industrialists. Would you agree with that? That the CIA isn't just running this on its own, although you could argue if they're really in control of anybody, but they certainly are doing the bidding of these wealthy, moneyed people you talked about just a few minutes ago.
On that a little bit. I'm not new to this topic. I've been studying it for years, and back it must be at least 10 years ago. I read a book by Alan Dulles called "The German Resistance to Hitler." Now, in college, the most important course I ever took was the German resistance to Hitler. And then there were some really valiant people, of great conscience who were resisting Hitler. But what I didn't know was that Alan Dulles had contact with some of these people. And in this book called The German Resistance to Hitler, chapter 5 begins with his discussion of the Abwehr, which is the German military intelligence. And he said, this is so rich. The best place to launch a conspiracy is in an intelligence agency. So, he's admitting that he's a conspiracy, a conspiracy monger. That's what he does. What more can I say?
And the term.
There was one other thing. One last point. Again, going back to my early study of all this stuff, there was a guy named Mike Rupert who was one of the early 9/11 whistleblowers, and I attended a meeting that he gave in San Francisco in November of 2001, and he was talking about the relationship of Alan Dulles with John F. Kennedy. We know that Alan Dulles was responsible for the conspiracy to take out Castro, and when Alan Dulles was confronted by John F. Kennedy, and Kennedy said, you're fired, Alan Dulles said, now I'm quoting Mike Rupert here. I've not been able to actually track down the quote, but Alan Dulles, according to Rupert, said, "You don't know who I work for."
Yeah, exactly. You don't know who I work for. Let's talk a little bit more about the Dulles brothers. You mentioned Kennedy fired Alan Dulles because he felt Dulles betrayed him, deceived him about the Bay of Pigs invasion. Mm-hmm. And it was General Curtis LeMay, who was either the chief of staff or high up at that time in the Kennedy administration, and they wanted to nuke and invade Cuba, and Kennedy refused. And so Kennedy fired Dulles. He got rid of General Curtis LeMay, and this was just one of the reasons why Kennedy was assassinated. Mm-hmm. But the role of the Dulles brothers, imagine this now. One is the head of the CIA, the other is the Secretary of State. The power that these two men had over United States foreign policy beginning in 1945. Truman succeeded Eisenhower, and then Kennedy succeeded, Truman succeeded FDR, and then Eisenhower succeeded him, and then Kennedy succeeded Eisenhower. And this is when I believe that the deep state really took over, and since 1963 has been in charge of United States foreign policy, and one could even argue domestic policy, which really was not very much to their interest. But it's basically been, Eric, that what we're talking about, the need that the United States capitalist empire has had for land, resources, and labor wherever they could find it around the world, whether it was Central and South America, whether it was in Asia, whether it was in Europe. And today, we're looking at with Russia. Russia's been the prize. Now, I want you to comment on something else that you wrote about. The end of the Soviet Union and the roots of the current crisis. You talked about the final chapters in Howard Zinn's book deal with the Clinton presidency and the Bush years. And you said this, and I know that Howard Zinn is a hero of yours and mine and so many others. You said, apparently, Zinn dropped the ball in this regard. He doesn't mention several things, such as the destruction of Yugoslavia by the United States and NATO, Yeltsin's stolen election in 1996, and he overlooks the fact that the CIA was using Islamic terrorists in Chechnya. Eric, pick it up from there and add a little clarity to what you said.
First of all, Howard Zinn was quite critical of the Soviet Union, and I would say he had no justification for doing that, specifically with the Chechnya war. The whole thrust of U.S. foreign policy has been to destroy Russia. So let's go. I mean, in 1918, we talked about this earlier outside of our discussion here. In 1918, or rather, going back to the American Revolution, Russia helped the American revolutionaries against the British, and yet when the Russian people had their revolution, the United States invaded the Soviet Union. So they never had any kind feelings toward the Soviet Union. Every time that they had détente, it was just a strategic move. So that's the overriding issue. Yeltsin, of course, was he was extremely unpopular because he was destroying the Russian economy. He sold off the assets that had been created by the labor of the Soviet people to oligarchs, and he didn't understand what he was doing, apparently, or he was bribed. Hard to say what, but he was so unpopular that he was going to lose the election in 1996. The communists were going to win, and of course, with massive amounts of money and propaganda, and probably vote theft, Yeltsin was able to maintain power. And as I mentioned with Chechnya, the United States was quite clearly backing jihadist, terrorists who were causing terrible problems in Chechnya, and it was Vladimir Putin who finally was able to put a stop to that. And as far as Yugoslavia is concerned, Yugoslavia was the last remaining quote unquote socialist state, and anywhere socialism exists, it has to be crushed. So they cooked up a false narrative about Serbs committing genocide against Bosnian Muslims, when in fact some of these Bosnian Muslims were associated with Osama bin Laden. So this is a classic example of how they will accuse their victim of their crime.
Yeah, it's disgusting, and it's really evil. This policy of the United States to use proxies and to use military solutions when diplomatic ones have been possible throughout our entire lives, really. Diplomacy has been a joke. It's thrown out the window as far as the United States is concerned. Uh, and I think it's really obvious to anybody who's paying attention that the goal of the United States is to preserve its hegemonic stature, its domination of the entire globe. Now, especially when it's being threatened, this hegemony is being threatened by Russia, China, the BRICS nations, who are moving in a different direction. But let's keep the focus now just for a minute before we get to what the ultimate end might be. You used another term, the empire of chaos. What did you mean by that?
Well, this is actually a book that was written by Pepe Escobar, who's a great mentor of mine. I've known him for a number of years, followed him for at least 10 years. I've met him personally. He's an amazingly insightful person. His contention is that when you create instability, that shakes things up so that the United States can basically swoop in and get control. So that's what we're talking about here.
Quote, or you were quoting Pepe Escobar. Incrementally, you said, I've been arguing that Washington's number one objective now is to prevent a full economic integration of Eurasia that would leave the United States as a non-hegemon, or worse still, an outsider. Is that what you meant? Or am I not?
Yeah, the U.S. is constantly meddling in other nations' affairs in order to prevent integration. So the United States that's what we're talking about by chaos, because the whole thrust of BRICS and Russian policy and Chinese policy is creating a multipolar world where all countries have sovereignty and they're working all together to build a better world for everybody. And that is not the policy of the West and specifically the United States. So what do? They always, go into countries. They use disgruntled side groups, give them lots of money to create problems, and they mess up a country, and then they say, oh, when the government of that country reacts to this, they say, oh, you're so anti-democratic. So their propaganda is very powerful, and it causes tremendous problems. And we see that in Georgia, we see that in Ukraine, of course, and now the United States invited countries from the Central Asian republics to Washington. They're trying to peel them away from Moscow. So that's the point, that this whole idea of chaos is to disintegrate the integration that the rest of the world really wants. And I would contend that it may be, and I'm speculating here, but it may be that the only real solution to this problem is for the United States to essentially either isolate itself or be quarantined, you might say, by the rest of the world, who just can't, they can't accept this constant troublemaking.
I'll come back to what I think the only solution might be in just a second, but I want to talk about the chaos that the empire is creating all over the world. No matter where you look, you can see it now in Eastern Europe. You can see it in Serbia. You can see it in the across the European Union. You can see it. Viktor Orban, for example, is resisting what's happening there. You can see it in Taiwan. You can see it in Armenia, Azerbaijan. You can see it anywhere you want to look. You can see it in Georgia. You can see it in Moldova. It's just chaos created by the United States. You can see it in the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. I mean, these people are acting like rabid dogs that just are thirsting for war with Russia, a massive neighbor of theirs that they have no chance of winning. And so you're right, it is an empire of chaos in an attempt to preserve its global domination. You mentioned, like, what could be the end of this? The total isolation of the United States? I don't know. I think, and Eric, you and I are looking at the United States. You're in Thailand, I'm in Russia, but we both know that the United States is on the verge of economic, political, social, and moral collapse. I don't want to minimize those words. Teetering on the verge of economic collapse. It's a debt and an economic reality in the United States that Trump is lying about. But when you talk to ordinary people, they're telling you the middle class has disappeared. There aren't any jobs. There's no future for the young people in the United States. They know this. They're beginning to resist. Socially, culturally, the United States is being torn apart. And in terms of spirituality or morality, there's no such thing left in the United States. And so I'm thinking that maybe the only solution is this complete economic, political, social, and moral collapse of the United States, somewhat like what happened to the Soviet Union. And whether or not there's someone like Vladimir Putin who can appear out of nowhere and help this country rise from the ashes, as he did with Russia and the Russian Federation, I'm not sure.
Regis, I'd like to expand on that. As I was mentioning earlier, the way the United States operates is according to its original user manual, so to speak, that was written by the founding fathers. And I call this a dynasty. This is not just if you look at the broad expanse of human history, the United States has had this current government for about 400 years. And that is about the length of a Chinese dynasty. And at a certain point, when a dynasty or a certain vector of a society reaches a certain level of contradictions, absurdity, preposterousness, and unworkability, something drastic happens. It happened to the Roman Empire. It happened with the Russian Empire, with the czars. It happened with France. And so I think there's a high possibility that either there will be an internal economic collapse because of this, multi-trillion-dollar debt, which how are they going to pay that back? Or they will, in desperation, throw a Hail Mary pass, so to speak, picking a fight with some country that is going to really humiliate them and cause a change. An example of that might be in Venezuela. If they pick a fight with Venezuela, it turns out Russia has supplied Venezuela with weapons that could sink several U.S. ships. And you can imagine what would happen if the United States lost the Gerald Ford, if it sank. That would be a major traumatic event where the American people might wake up and realize, hey, maybe we're not as powerful as we thought we were, and maybe we got to get back to work here. And by the way, those people who are running things, they're completely not only evil, but they're incompetent. We have to get other people in there, and there are other people. So, for example, there's a guy named Michael Hudson who's an excellent economist. He's written several books about this. One of them is called Super Imperialism. I just friended him on Facebook. I sent him a message. You're the best Secretary of the Treasury that the United States never had. So there are some good people out there who could kind of redeem the country if they had the power. But the people who run the country have to be thoroughly discredited through their own, incompetence and arrogance and megalomania, which ultimately works against them.
All right, I want to bring this back to United States foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia. I think we've made a pretty good argument that United States foreign policy is not going to change. The agenda has been set really in stone. There are, in my opinion, too many people in Russia, academics, maybe even politicians, who are looking at what happened in Alaska, and with Trump's proposed peace plans and overtures to Russia through rose-colored glasses, thinking there's some hope attached to this. Mm-hmm. I have argued strongly against that view, that there is no hope for any change in United States foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia. The goal over all of these years, and explicitly stated by the president, the last one that was losing his marbles, that the strategic goal of the United States is the strategic defeat of Russia. Strategic defeat of Russia. Break it up, balkanize it, and do what America has been doing for its entire history, the theft of land and resources and labor. Eric,
absolutely.
Do you think, and would you like to speak to anybody in Russia, and you've been here many times, who is still thinking there's some hope for a rapprochement between the United States and Russia?
I first went to Russia in 2015. It was the 70th anniversary of the victory over the Nazis. And I got there. I didn't know anybody. I don't speak any Russian or except for a couple of words. And this young woman, about 25 years old, was giving several of us a street tour of Moscow. And she was talking about how bad Stalin was and all this kind of stuff and in the Soviet Union. And I said to her, "My country is trying to destroy your country." She didn't get that. In a more recent trip, I was in an office of a travel agent, and I needed some help with some travel related stuff. And we were talking. She's a very nice person, and she says, "Oh, and guess what? I'm going to go to America." And I said, "America is a mess. Don't go." And I proceeded to explain to her some things, and she said, "Okay, thank you very much. Please go." So there's a lot of sentiment. The problem that I see with Russians is that they're a much deeper. I feel like they're spiritually much deeper people than Americans, because they've suffered so much more, that they have a much deeper feeling. And also, I think the fact that their culture is based on Russian Orthodoxy, which is not as I would say dualistic. It's not. They have a kind of a different attitude than Western philosophical notions. So they have a much kinder and trusting attitude about them. And that's unfortunate in a sense, because they don't necessarily see the danger. So to any Russian who's listening to this, I would just say, look at the history. The United States had its revolution. The Russians helped us. The United States had a civil war. The Russians protected us from the French and the British, who wanted to blockade U.S. ports. And what happened when the Russian people had their revolution? We attacked them. And then we wouldn't recognize them as a country. And then we supported the Nazis to help them. Many of the trucks and other equipment that the Nazis used were built by U.S.-based companies like General Motors, IBM, and Ford. So people need to understand in Russia, people need to understand they need to be very, very careful with their dealings with the United States. The Native Americans said it clearly. White men speak with forked tongue. You cannot trust these people. They've broken every treaty they've ever signed, and they just have to understand that. So that's what I would have to say to Russian people.
Eric, I agree with you with that assessment. Where there's an awful lot of Russians that hold that belief that, oh, America, I'd love to go. My brother-in-law is in Florida and he's doing great in Miami. You got to be wondering what he's involved in. But Eric, I have to believe that President Putin, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and others, not everybody in Putin's circle in the Kremlin, fully understand what you and I have been talking about, that the United States is agreement incapable, and they have basically stated openly, we've turned east away from the West, but we remain open to dialogue. They want to maintain the moral, ethical high road, while they really have said, we don't believe you anymore. We don't trust you anymore. And you know what? We're basically going to isolate you, and we'll see what happens. I think that's where Russia is. I think they understand that nothing will change with Donald Trump and any of his histrionics, his command of the 24/7 news cycle with one crazy, insane, unbelievable statement after another. I think the Russian leadership fully understands what's going on.
I want to ask you a question. I just heard that there have been some new talks or possibility of talks between Steve Witkoff, who is a businessman. What are these businessmen doing? Diplomacy. The Russians have a foreign service with trained people. They trained for decades to be diplomats, and our foreign policy establishment is so shallow that we have to depend on business people who have no idea of the context of things. And yet here he is, this guy Steve Witkoff, and he's dealing with some American trained Russian person, Kirill Dmitriev, and they're trying to do deals. So I wonder, what is going on with these deals? Is that just smoke and mirrors to kind of keep the Americans mollified to think, yeah, well, maybe we can do something here, and we'll be able to make some money with the Russians. And meanwhile, of course, the rest of the American foreign policy establishment is ready to stab Russia in the back. So it's this kind of there's a Chinese expression for this: a sword hidden within a smile.
Yeah. Well, the big news today is this secret peace agreement between the United States and Russia in Ukraine. And I've read through that, and I'm telling you, it's a joke. It's just another distraction. There is no way that Russia can or will agree to anything in that agreement. Russia has said over and over again, Eric, there are three main goals for the special military operation: the demilitarization of Ukraine, that means reducing its army to nothing or very small; denazification, which is going to mean a rewriting of the Constitution, a repopulation of their Rada, and probably years of re-education in Western Ukraine for sure. The third goal was the complete neutrality of Ukraine. No NATO ever. But then what people are not paying much attention to, and certainly not the United States, Russia's demand that the root causes of their security dilemma be addressed. And what that means is from 1991, the broken promise of the United States to the Soviet Union not to move 1 inch eastward towards Russia of NATO. Clinton began to break that, and NATO has now basically surrounded Russia, incorporating most of the former Soviet republics. This is what Russia is saying. We've really got to go back to the 1991 borders. Mm-hmm. And Eric, there ain't no solution to that. I don't see any possible solution to peace in Ukraine except for the unconditional surrender of Ukraine, NATO, and the United States. They're going to have to completely give up on this. Russia will assume total control of all of Ukraine. A lot of people think I'm crazy. I don't see any alternative for Russia. What are your thoughts?
Well, I completely agree with you, and I go even further in that was the whole point of my article, which is that it's not simply the manifestations that have appeared with NATO's encroachment and baiting of Russia and provoking Russia, so that finally Russia said, enough is enough. It's the whole Western imperialist mindset that has to change, and that gets back to the whole mentality of the United States that no, we're just an ordinary country. We have our own problems. We need to mind our own business and build up our own country instead of trying to take other countries down. That would take a major shift in mindset of the people who actually run the United States. The United States does have good people. It was, Tom Paine and Benjamin Franklin. These were the people who should have formed the basis of the United States, but they were shoved aside. And the result is it's manifested in this crisis situation that we're in now. The people who have been running the country for centuries need to step down and help people who actually have some heart and some compassion and some wisdom to run the country instead of greed and slaughter and theft. That's what has to change. And and the only thing that's going to do that is either a complete societal collapse or an outside intervention where these people are totally discredited, is what happened with Nazi Germany in World War II. The people who were running that country had to be completely discredited so that something new and better could arise.
I'm going to repeat myself, but I predicted this in my 2016 film, 30 Seconds to Midnight, after I came to Russia the first time. My conclusion in that film was, will the neocons and their global moneyed economic masters recognize they have lost this epic battle for the future order of the world, which we're talking about? Will they take the whole world down with them in a nuclear Armageddon? That's the question. And I think that's how close we are today. Given the belligerent rhetoric, the threats of Donald Trump, either militarily or with secondary sanctions on anybody that wants to deal with Russia, this is where we are. So close to nuclear Armageddon. Eric, I can't thank you.
Yeah, it's like Russia and China are the psychiatrist at the mental hospital, and the patient is the United States and the Western Europe. They have a psychological problem. That is the root cause of all of this. The American leadership class has a psychological problem. They're obsessed with power, and how do you reason with that? It's like reasoning with a rabid dog. That's what we're dealing with here.